I am Naomi Carter, 27 years old, and the night my mother laughed in my face, I finally understood that no amount of hard work would ever make me a daughter in her eyes. I was sitting at my parents' dining table while they gushed over my twin sister's wedding like it was some royal event, talking about imported flowers, a private garden venue, a designer gown, and a honeymoon so expensive it made no sense for a family that had always told me to be practical. I let them talk until I asked the one question that should never have caused a room to go silent. What about my share of the wedding fund? They all looked at me like I had interrupted something sacred. Then my mother leaned back in her chair, smiled like she was explaining something obvious to a child, and said, "Gold and dirt are not the same." My sister actually clapped at that. Clapped. Like humiliating me was the punchline to a joke they had all been waiting to tell. I did not cry. I did not argue. I did not give them the scene they probably wanted so they could call me dramatic and ungrateful. I just stood up, took my keys, walked out of the house, and drove through the night without answering a single call. By sunrise, my phone looked insane. 53 missed calls from my mother, 20 from my sister, voicemails, texts, begging, pleading, telling me to come back before I made a terrible mistake. I stared at the screen for a long time before I finally sent one message. "Why are you begging a piece of dirt?" But to understand why that one text sent my whole family into panic, you need to know what they had been taking from me for years. By the time my sister and I were old enough to understand how families worked, I already knew ours had a favorite. We were twins, but that was where the similarity ended. She had the kind of personality people noticed right away. She was loud, charming, dramatic, in a way that made adults laugh instead of worry. She knew how to walk into a room and make it feel like an audience had just arrived for her. I was quieter. I liked plans, routines, and knowing exactly where things stood. My mother called me serious like it was a flaw. My father called me difficult whenever I asked why the rules were different for me. My sister got away with messes because she was spirited. I got punished for the smallest mistakes because I should have known better. That was the story in our house. She was the one who needed softness. I was the one expected to survive without it. At birthday parties, she got the bigger cake because she liked attention more. At school events, my mother would miss my academic ceremonies, but somehow never missed a single one of my sister's performances, even the mediocre ones. If relatives visited, they would hear all about how beautiful and social my sister was. And then my mother would gesture at me like I was a side note and say I was the smart one. That was the box they put me in early. Useful, but forgettable. Capable, but unloved. The older we got, the more obvious it became that my parents were not trying to hide it. They bought her clothes because she cared about fashion. They gave her extra spending money because she had a social life to maintain. They let her cry her way out of consequences while telling me I was too cold whenever I refused to play along. I used to think if I achieved enough, if I behaved well enough, if I made their lives easier, eventually they would look at me the way they looked at her. But every win of mine only seemed to irritate them more. When I got the highest grades in school, my mother said I was making my sister feel insecure. When I got a scholarship opportunity, my father said I should stop acting superior. When I worked weekends to buy my own laptop, my mother called me stingy for not sharing it more. Nothing I did was allowed to belong to me. If I succeeded, I was selfish. If I set boundaries, I was difficult. If I stayed quiet, they assumed I could handle more neglect. The wedding fund was the one thing I let myself believe might be fair. My grandparents had started it when we were teenagers. It was supposed to be equal, a gift for both granddaughters, something practical for two futures that had not been written yet. I remember my grandmother squeezing my hand and saying, "No matter what happens later, this will be one thing no one can take from you." I held on to that sentence for years. I even added to the fund myself once I started working part-time in high school. Not a huge amount at first, but enough to matter to me, because every dollar represented hours of effort no one had forced me to give. I contributed because I thought one day when I got married, I would at least walk into that part of my life knowing something had been saved for me too. It sounds naive now, but when you grow up half-loved, you become an expert at building hope out of scraps. You take the smallest sign of fairness and treat it like proof that maybe the story is not finished yet. That was my mistake. I thought the wedding fund meant there was one part of my life my family could not rewrite around my sister. I had no idea they were already preparing to do exactly that. The easiest way to understand the difference between me and my sister as adults is this. I built things. She performed them. I worked my way through college with scholarships, internships, and jobs that taught me how to keep impossible schedules from falling apart. I ended up in wedding and event operations because I was good under pressure and even better at cleaning up disasters before anyone else realized there had been one. I knew contracts, vendor timelines, deposit schedules, contingency plans, and exactly how much emotion people attached to one perfect day. I also knew how much money people were willing to burn just to make strangers envy them for a few hours. That part never impressed me. I moved to Charlotte after college and built a life that made sense to me. My apartment was not glamorous, but it was peaceful. My work was demanding, but it was real. I paid my bills, kept my promises, and learned that stability was a luxury when you had grown up in emotional chaos. My sister went the other direction. She reinvented herself every 6 months depending on what kind of attention seemed easiest to get. She tried boutique fitness, then lifestyle blogging, then social media brand deals, then event hosting. None of which lasted long enough to become a real career. But because she looked polished and knew how to flatter people, my parents kept acting like she was on the brink of something huge. Every time she failed, they rebranded it as potential. Every time I succeeded, they treated it like a personality defect. By then, I was used to it. What they could not diminish was the life I had started building for myself. I met Ethan at a venue walkthrough after a storm had knocked out power during a rehearsal dinner. Everyone else was panicking. He was one of the architects consulting on the restoration of the property, and while the bride's family was spiraling, he was the only person in the room calmer than I was. We ended up laughing in a dark hallway over emergency candles and ruined seating charts. He was thoughtful without being performative, kind without needing credit for it, and he listened in a way that made me feel like I was not competing with noise just to be heard. We dated for 2 years before talking seriously about marriage, and when we did, it felt nothing like the chaos I had grown up around. We talked budget before flowers. We talked guest count before aesthetics. We talked about what mattered and what did not. We wanted something intimate, elegant, and honest. No spectacle, no pretending. Just a room full of people who actually loved us. For the first time in my life, I could picture a wedding without dread attached to it. Around that same time, my sister announced she was engaged to Miles Holloway, a corporate attorney with expensive taste, polished manners, and the kind of family background my mother had been chasing her whole life, through country club invitations and strategic friendships. The way my parents reacted, you would have thought my sister had just married into royalty. Overnight, every conversation became about venues, menus, fittings, social circles, and how this wedding had to be perfect because it would open doors. That phrase stuck with me. Open doors? For whom? Not for the bride, really. Not even for the marriage. It was for my parents, for their image, for the fantasy they had always attached to my sister because she looked like the life they wanted people to think they lived. My mother started calling me more often, not to ask how I was, but to pick my brain about vendors' contracts and timelines. Could I recommend a florist? Could I take a quick look at a catering agreement? Did I know anyone who could help them get a better rate on the venue? My first instinct should have been to say no, but old habits are hard to kill. Some part of me still wanted to be useful, because usefulness had always been the closest thing I got to approval. So I answered a few questions. I connected them to a venue rep I trusted. I flagged a bad clause in one contract. I told them what realistic costs look like if they wanted quality without getting scammed. My mother thanked me like she was doing me a favor by letting me contribute. My sister barely thanked me at all. She was too busy posting mock-ups of floral arches and champagne towers to her followers, as if she had built the whole thing herself. Even then, I told myself it did not matter. I had Ethan. I had my own future. I had that fund. Or at least I thought I did. I believed when our time came, there would still be something left that had my name on it. I did not yet understand that to my family, my competence was never something to honor. It was just another resource to drain. The dinner, where everything finally broke, started like every other family gathering in my parents' house. Too much performance. Too much pretending. My mother had invited me down for what she called a small planning dinner before the final wedding push. I almost did not go, but Ethan encouraged me to keep things civil if I could. He had not grown up inside a family like mine, but he understood enough to know I was always mourning the family I wished I had, not the one that existed. So I drove in for the evening carrying a bottle of wine and the stupid hope that maybe this time they would at least behave like decent people for one meal. My sister was glowing in that carefully managed way she always had when she knew all eyes were on her. My mother kept bringing out binders and swatches and seating charts as if she were staging a campaign instead of a wedding. My father talked numbers in a vague, smug way that suggested he wanted to sound important without ever saying anything concrete. For the first half hour, I mostly listened. Then my mother started discussing a last-minute upgrade to the venue package. More flowers, better lighting, a luxury guest transportation option no one actually needed. I asked the question gently at first. I said, "If you are spending at this level, what does that mean for the rest of the wedding fund?" My mother stopped moving. My sister looked down at her plate. My father cleared his throat and reached for his water. I knew right then. I just did not know how bad it was. I asked again, more directly this time. "What does that mean for my share?" My mother set down her fork and gave me a look I had seen my whole life, the one that said I was about to be punished for ruining her preferred version of reality. She said, "There really is no your share anymore. Most of it went into your sister's wedding." She said it casually, like she was explaining weather. I stared at her. I asked, "What about the money I put into it?" She shrugged. "We all contribute to family Naomi." Then I asked the question that made her smile. "So you spent my grandparents' money and my money on her and never planned to tell me?" She leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms, and laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not an embarrassed one, a cruel one. "Gold and dirt are not the same," she said. "Your sister is marrying into a world where appearances matter. That investment makes sense. You and Ethan are doing some tiny, tasteful thing. You do not need the same kind of help." For a second, I honestly did not hear the room. It was like my body had gone silent from the inside out. Then my sister clapped, once sharp and smug, and said, "Mom is harsh, but she is not wrong." I think that was the moment something permanent in me cooled. Because all my life, I had pictured a breaking point as some big, dramatic explosion. I thought if I was ever pushed too far, I would finally scream. Instead, I became very still. I looked at all three of them and realized none of them expected consequences. They expected pain, maybe tears, maybe an argument they could twist into proof that I was unstable and jealous. What they did not expect was for me to become strategic. So I stood up. My mother told me not to be dramatic. My father said we could discuss it later. My sister rolled her eyes and asked if I was seriously going to ruin the mood over money. I picked up my bag, my keys, and my coat. I said nothing. I walked out while my mother was still calling after me. The second I got into my car, I did not cry. I opened my laptop, because in their rush to build a luxury wedding they could not actually afford, they had leaned on more of my professional access than they realized. The venue rep they were using had agreed to a temporary hold because of my recommendation. The floral designer had approved a discount through a referral code tied to my company network. A transportation vendor had only delayed full payment because I had vouched that this family would not embarrass me. I sent 3 emails and made 2 calls before I even backed out of the driveway. All professional, all clean. I informed the vendors that I was withdrawing personal and professional sponsorship from any pending flexibility arrangements connected to the Carter Holloway wedding. I clarified that I was not financially responsible for any outstanding balances and that no one should rely on my name or reputation moving forward. I did not ask anyone to cancel anything. I did not need to. I just removed the support they had built their fantasy on. Then I drove back to Charlotte through the night with my phone face down beside me. By the time I got home, I had 7 missed calls. By sunrise, it was over 70. 53 from my mother, 20 from my sister. A flood of voicemails that moved from outrage to panic in less than 6 hours. The venue needed immediate confirmation. The florist was pausing production. Transportation was suspended until payment cleared. My sister's makeup artist had heard there were contract problems and wanted reassurance. For once in their lives, they were not calling because they wanted something from me quietly. They were calling because everything they had built by stepping on me was shaking. I listened to one voicemail from my mother where she sounded breathless and furious and scared all at once. "Naomi, call me back right now. You are taking this too far." Then one from my sister, sharp with panic under the attitude. "Do not do this to me. Do not ruin my wedding because you are bitter." I stared at the screen for a long time before typing my reply. "Why are you begging a piece of dirt?" Then I turned my phone off and finally went to sleep. When I woke up that afternoon, I expected to feel guilty. I had been trained for guilt. My entire childhood had conditioned me to believe that withholding help from people who treated me badly was somehow more shameful than the way they treated me in the first place. But guilt was not what I felt. Relief was. Not joy, exactly. Not revenge in the cartoonish sense people imagine when they hear that word. It was the deep, almost unfamiliar relief of finally understanding that I did not have to keep volunteering to be the bridge people burned while standing on it. My phone was still exploding when I turned it back on. My mother had shifted into victim mode. "How could you do this to your own family after everything we have done for you?" My father, who had barely spoken the night before, sent one cold message, accusing me of sabotaging your sister out of envy. My sister cycled through every version of herself in a single thread. First furious, then mocking, then pleading, then threatening to tell everyone I had tried to destroy her wedding because I could not stand to see her happy. That last one almost made me laugh. People like my sister always assume everyone else is motivated by the same shallow hunger they are. It never occurred to her that I was not trying to take her spotlight. I was just done carrying the stage. I did not answer any of them. I called Ethan instead. I told him everything, including the sentence my mother had used. He was quiet for a few seconds in a way that told me he was angrier than he wanted me to hear. Then he asked the only question that mattered. "Did you do anything wrong?" I said no. He said, "Then let them deal with what they created." That was one of the reasons I loved him. He never confused peace with surrender. Over the next few days, I learned through a mix of voicemails, mutual acquaintances, and the kind of family gossip that travels faster when rich people might be embarrassed, that the wedding had not collapsed, but it had cracked. My parents had scrambled to keep it alive. My father liquidated part of an account he had no business touching that quickly. My mother borrowed from 2 relatives she privately looked down on. My sister cut certain decorative extras, but only the ones guests would not immediately notice in photographs. They kept the venue, but at a reduced package. They kept the dress because, of course, they did. They kept the performance of wealth, but barely. Behind the scenes, it sounded like panic and blame and credit cards pushed to the limit. Several guests noticed that vendors seemed tense. One of my mother's friends overheard an argument about unpaid balances near the reception entrance. A cousin texted me that my absence was the real topic of the night. Apparently, people found it strange that a twin sister was missing from such an important wedding, and even stranger that no one could offer the same explanation twice. Some were told I had a work emergency. Some were told I was sick. Some were told Ethan and I had broken up. My favorite rumor was that I had become too emotionally unstable to attend. That one had my mother's fingerprints all over it. Still, the photos my sister posted afterward looked glossy enough if you did not know what had happened outside the frame. She smiled like she had won. Miles smiled like a man posing beside an expensive acquisition. My mother looked exhausted under professional makeup. My father looked older than I remembered. The comments online were full of the usual empty praise. Dream wedding, fairy tale bride, obsessed with this couple. I looked at the pictures once and then never again. The strangest part was that I did not feel consumed by any of it. I had expected anger to keep burning, but distance changed the texture of everything. My family had built their lives around image, and the moment I stepped back, I could see how fragile all of it really was. They needed me more than they would ever admit. Not because they loved me, but because I was the practical spine in a family addicted to appearances. Without me, they could still throw a party. They just could not do it cleanly. Ethan and I moved ahead with our own plans in the quiet way that made me feel sane. We toured a lakeside property outside Charlotte that was smaller than any venue my mother would have approved of, and immediately knew it was right. It had old trees, soft light, and a view that did not need to prove anything to anyone. We talked to a local chef instead of a luxury caterer. We cut our guest list down to people who had actually shown up for us in real life. Every choice felt like a correction, not just to my wedding, but to my understanding of what celebration was supposed to be. It was not performance. It was witness. It was not about who could be impressed. It was about who could be trusted. Meanwhile, the calls from my family slowed. Not because they had forgiven me, but because they were busy trying to maintain the illusion that everything was fine. I knew that phase would not last. Debt has a way of making truth louder. So does marriage when it is built on image instead of intimacy. I did not have to wish for consequences. I had already seen enough weddings to know they were coming. About 3 months after the wedding, the first real crack started reaching me from outside the family bubble. One of my former college friends, who still moved in overlapping social circles with my sister, messaged me after midnight with a question that looked casual, but was not. "Is everything okay with your sister and Miles?" I asked why. She said, "Because Sienna has been posting a lot of vague quotes about loneliness and fake love, and she was seen crying at a restaurant while Miles left early." I should have felt sympathy. Instead, what I felt was recognition. Not because I had wanted her marriage to fail, but because I had seen the transaction from the beginning. Miles had not fallen in love with my sister. He had selected her. She was polished enough for photographs, eager enough to be shaped, and shallow enough to mistake being displayed for being cherished. My mother loved him because he came with status. My sister loved him because he came with status and expensive suits, and a last name that opened the kind of doors she had always wanted to stand in front of. But status is not intimacy. Being chosen is not being known. Once the wedding ended and the performance stopped being exciting, they were left with each other, and there was not much there. Around the same time, my father's financial situation began unraveling in a way that would have been almost poetic if it had not been so pathetic. He had always prided himself on being the smartest man in the room when it came to money. That was part of why the wedding overspending had gone so far. He truly believed he could outmaneuver reality later. Only later arrived faster than expected. Emergency borrowing turned into rolling balances. Rolling balances turned into pressure. Pressure turned into mistakes. One of his colleagues apparently learned he had borrowed privately from client social circles to cover personal obligations. And while I never got the full story, I heard enough to know his professional credibility took a hit. My mother's boutique, which had already been limping along on the strength of local image rather than actual profit, started missing payments too. She sold inventory at discount, then pretended it was a seasonal strategy. She canceled a charity committee commitment she had bragged about for years. Friends she used to entertain stopped calling as often once there was no longer a polished table to sit at. My parents had spent so long curating the appearance of stability that they had no idea how to survive without applause. That was when the messages started again. They came through numbers I did not know, through distant relatives, through one old neighbor who left me a long voicemail about how family is family no matter what. My mother wrote me a letter and mailed it to my office. Not my apartment, my office. That alone told me she still did not understand shame. In the letter, she tried every version of the truth except the real one. She wrote that wedding stress had caused things to be said in the wrong tone. She wrote that families make mistakes. She wrote that my sister was struggling in her marriage and needed support from her twin. She did not write that she had called me dirt. She did not write that she had stolen money meant for me. She did not write that she had only noticed my value once my absence had a price tag. I folded the letter and threw it away. A week later, my sister called from a private number. I should not have answered, but something in me wanted to hear what her voice sounded like when life stopped clapping for her. She did not bother with small talk. She said she and Miles were having difficulties. She said marriage was harder than she expected. She said he was always traveling, always working, always irritated, and lately he had started making comments about her spending and her family's instability. Then she moved to the real point. She asked if I still had contacts who could help my mother's boutique with an event partnership, maybe something upscale that would bring in new clients. When I stayed silent, she pushed further. She asked if Ethan knew any investors. I almost admired the nerve. Even then, in the middle of her own unraveling, she still saw me as a utility, not a sister, not a person she had humiliated, a tool she hoped had not learned its worth. I told her no. She got sharp, immediately accused me of enjoying this, accused me of waiting for them to suffer so I could feel superior. That was when I finally said something that had been true for years. I do not need you to suffer to know who I am. I just needed to stop letting you decide it. She hung up on me. Not long after that, a family acquaintance told me my parents were quietly preparing to sell their house and move into a much smaller place. Officially, they wanted less maintenance. Unofficially, debt was choking them. The same house where I had spent years being told my role was to understand, to adjust, to give more, was now one more thing they could not afford to keep. Ethan found me sitting in our kitchen the night I heard that news, staring at nothing. He asked if I was okay. I told him I did not know what I felt. There was no triumph in it, just a strange ache for the fact that people can destroy their own lives just to protect their pride. He sat beside me and said something I never forgot. Some people would rather lose everything than admit they were wrong to the one person they treated the worst. He was right. My family was not collapsing because I had abandoned them. They were collapsing because every major choice they made was designed to preserve a lie. The lie that image mattered more than character. The lie that favoritism had no cost. The lie that the child who kept everything functioning would always stay close enough to be used. By then, I was done mistaking their emergencies for my responsibility. I had spent too much of my life paying emotional interest on debts I never owed. If they were finally being forced to face what they had built, then that was not cruelty. That was consequence. The final time they reached out, it was almost 8 months after that dinner. By then, Ethan and I had finished nearly all the planning for our wedding. We had our invitations, our menu, our music, and a guest list so intentional that every name on it made me feel calmer instead of obligated. My life had become so steady that the chaos I came from felt like a separate country. Then, one evening, just as I was leaving work, my phone rang with a video call from an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. My mother's face filled the screen first, older and thinner than I remembered. Her makeup gone, her posture collapsed in a way I had never seen. My father was beside her, looking as though pride had finally become too heavy to carry. And behind them, on the edge of a sofa in what was clearly not their old house, sat my sister. Silent. No perfect hair, no smugness, no applause left in her. For a moment, none of us spoke. Then my mother started crying. Real crying. Not the theatrical kind she used to produce in public when she wanted sympathy. She said my name the way people say it when they have run out of every other strategy. She told me they had made terrible mistakes. She told me they had lost the house. She told me my sister and Miles were separating and that the divorce was getting ugly. She told me my father's career was damaged and things were not easy anymore. Then she said the words I had waited my whole life to hear and no longer needed. We were wrong. I looked at her and realized apology without accountability still sounds incomplete. So I asked the only question that mattered. Wrong about what? She closed her eyes for a second, like the answer physically hurt. Wrong about you, she said. Wrong about your worth. Wrong about the way we treated you. Wrong about choosing appearances over fairness. My sister still would not look at the camera. My father finally spoke and said he should have stopped it years ago. He said he had told himself he was keeping peace, when really he was protecting the wrong child from consequences and sacrificing the right one to do it. I believed he meant it, and somehow that made it sadder, not better. Because truth arriving late does not restore the years it stole. Then my mother said what she had really called for. She asked if we could start over. She asked if I could find it in my heart to help the family heal. She did not ask for money directly, but the shape of the request was the same as it had always been. Come back. Stabilize us. Make this easier to survive. I looked at all three of them and felt something I never expected to feel in that moment. Not hatred, not vindication. Clarity. The kind that comes when grief has finished turning into wisdom. I told them I was getting married soon. I told them it would be small and peaceful and filled with people who had never made me earn basic dignity. My mother started crying harder and asked if there was still a chance they could be part of it. My sister finally looked up then, and for the first time in my life, she looked small. Not because life had humbled her into goodness, but because it had stripped away the audience she used to mistake for love. I took a breath and gave them the truth they had spent years avoiding. You taught me exactly what I was to this family when you took what was mine, laughed in my face, and expected me to stay. I believed you. I built my life around that lesson. Now you have to live with it too. My mother whispered, "Please." My sister opened her mouth like she wanted to argue, then closed it again. My father just stared at me with the look of a man seeing the final bill for a debt he had ignored too long. I told them I did not wish ruin on any of them. I told them I genuinely hoped they learned how to treat people before they needed something from them. I told them I hoped my sister one day understood that being favored is not the same as being loved, and that being protected from consequences can leave a person weak in all the ways that matter. Then I said I was not coming back. I was not reopening a door they had only knocked on once life became unbearable on their side of it. I ended the call before they could answer. A month later, I married Ethan beside a quiet lake under strings of warm lights and old trees that did not need decorating to feel beautiful. There was no spectacle, no false luxury, no desperate need to impress anyone. Just vows, laughter, people who showed up early because they wanted to help, and the steady feeling that I was no longer standing in the shadow of someone else's story. When I walked toward Ethan, I did not think about what my family had taken from me. I thought about what they had failed to destroy. My peace, my judgment, my ability to love without humiliating someone first. That, more than anything, was the ending they never expected me to have. If there is any lesson in what happened, it is not just that cruelty comes back around, though it often does. It is that favoritism poisons everyone it touches. It damages the child who is neglected, but it also hollows out the child who is worshipped by teaching them that love can be replaced with indulgence, and that value comes from display instead of character. It teaches parents to confuse control with care and image with success, until they wake up surrounded by the wreckage of their own choices. And it teaches the overlooked child one of the hardest lessons of all, that sometimes healing begins the moment you stop begging to be treated fairly by people who profit from your silence. Family should be the first place a person learns dignity, not the place they lose it. Love without respect is not love. Forgiveness without change is not reconciliation. And protecting your peace from people who only recognize your worth once they need it is not cruelty. It is self-respect.